Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. For 50 years, the most exclusive club in the world has been the Club of Nuclear Nations, now renegade North Korea. Some have called it a crazy state, may be only months away from joining the nuclear elite. What can be done to stop North Korea from getting the bomb? Joining us today to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Richard Perle, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Paul Warnke, arms control negotiator during the Carter administration, now a director of the Arms Control Association, Leonard Spector, director of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and author of Nuclear Ambitions, The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, 1989-1990, and Robert Manning, a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute and author of Back to the Future, Toward a Post-Nuclear Ethic. The topic before this House, defusing the Korean bomb, this week on Think Tank. Almost 50 years ago, Korea became the first battlefield of the Cold War. The United States led the United Nations to fight a bloody war to defend the South from communist North Korea. 54,000 Americans and 4 million Koreans died in the war, which ended in a draw in 1953. Today, troops from the North and South face each other in a tense standoff across Korea's demilitarized zone. South Korea's capital, Seoul, lies only 18 miles from the border, and Japan is 120 miles offshore within missile and bomber range of North Korea. The United States is committed by treaty to defending South Korea should the North attack. Thus, the 38,000 American troops on the Korean peninsula are a tripwire. North Korea, an isolated nation often called the Hermit Kingdom, has over 1 million men under arms, and it has an enormous artillery and rocket advantage over the South. But North Korea lost its chief patron when Soviet communism collapsed. Recently, to the horror of the world, North Korea has apparently decided to build nuclear weapons. The absolute ruler of North Korea is Kim Il-sung, installed in 1946 by Joseph Stalin. In 1983, Kim ordered the assassination of South Korean cabinet members. In 1987, he had agents blow up a South Korean civilian airliner. These actions and others cause many to fear what he might do with nuclear weapons. On June 16th, former President Jimmy Carter met with Kim Il-sung, who allegedly pledged to freeze his nuclear bomb program and to hold a summit between his country and South Korea. Some see this as an opportunity for peace, while others believe that Kim is merely playing for time. But one thing is clear, North Korea is dangerously close to having a nuclear bomb. Mr. Manning, what is North Korea like? Who are we dealing with up there?
Well, if George Orwell were ever to construct a state, North Korea would be probably the most likely product. It's not your run-of-the-mill communist state. I'd say it's somewhere between David Koresh and Mao Zedong. It has a lot of qualities, almost like a large religious cult, even within the sort of Confucian hierarchy system.
And do people there really accept Kim Il-sung as the sun god or whatever it is? Or I mean, we heard that about a lot of the communist states in Eastern Europe. And then we found out that there was a whole dissident class.
They have been enormously successful at insulating themselves from the information revolution. Radios only get one station in most people's houses. There's really, the people don't know that the information flow is very minimum outside the elite.
Paul, what do you think? Does that sound about right?
I've never been there, and I'll take Bob Manning's word for it. It sounds correct to me.
Leonard?
I would have to say that when I was there 2 years back, you did get that sense of a totally indoctrinated society that does support the leader and doesn't have the slightest bit of political flexibility or familiarity with the outside world.
The Hermit Kingdom, so-called. That's
what you see. There obviously some people do travel abroad and have been there, but the population at large seems very much indoctrinated and under Kim's control.
Richard?
Well, and the population at large, in any case, has nothing to say about the policies of the government, which are made by Kim and his son and a handful of people around him. Yes.
But I would just add, from a policy point of view, I think the elite that I've encountered and seen are quite cosmopolitan. They're aware of the world. They're aware of the desperate situation their government is in, and this notion of a crazy state or an irrational actor is a bit overblown. Within they have an internal logic. It may not be our version of a Cartesian world, but there's a logic and almost a predictability.
Well, let me. You used a very interesting phrase, the crazy state. During this 50-year-long debate about the missiles and who's got them, and the Herman Kahn and thinking the unthinkable and all that sort of stuff. And I know particularly Paul and Richard were very much, and as well as our other panelists, were very involved in this dialogue. What is, as a term of art, in that field, a crazy state? Maybe Richard and then Paul.
Well, Paul and I had lots of differences, but I think we both considered that the Soviet leadership was rational in the sense that it would not undertake a suicidal act, that it would probably not even take risks so extreme that it could lead to a nuclear war. I don't think we can have any such confidence with Kim Il-sung.
Well, I think we'll see.
But crazy state was part of the debate all these years, wasn't it?
It has been.
Yeah.
I'd say they're clearly a nasty state. We'll try and find out whether they are crazy in the talks. Because I think at this point, they ought to recognize that in talking with them, we have not foreclosed other options. We shouldn't set any conditions on talking, and they can't set any conditions either. Now, if they behave in a fashion which requires us to use other options than negotiation, then they're probably crazy.
Leonard, isn't something going on right now with a time fuse about the reprocessing rods? I mean, it gets kind of complicated, but where there really is a time fuse, and you can make the case that President Carter's initiative is merely giving Kim Il-sung an opportunity to, let those rods cool in order to build 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 bombs?
Right, hypothetically, well, not hypothetically, right now we know that they have spent fuel from this reactor, which is sitting in a cooling pond. The fuel contains enough plutonium for 4 or 5 bombs as soon as it might be processed. We've said as long as the talks continue, we don't want you to reprocess this material, don't want you to get the plutonium, and they have agreed. What I'm fearful of, however, is that as these rods cool and become easy to process, let's say in a couple of months, maybe sooner, the North Koreans may decide that these talks don't look quite so good, and they may start to do the reprocessing. They may even do it with the inspectors present, in which case they would wind up with a stockpile of plutonium. If one day they wanted to kick the inspectors out, they would really have everything they need for a bomb, and we would always be on the edge, wondering what was going to happen next.
Well, I think this is the situation we have now is the worst case is they may have enough plutonium for a bomb or two. If they go ahead the next step, then we're looking at 7 to 8 total possible bombs, and then the nightmare scenarios of exports to Iran, Libya, and the things that are really dangerous about this start to kick in. And so I think we're really at the beginning of the end game on this issue.
Yeah, but it's up to us to see to it that that does not happen. And I think that by agreeing to talk, we are exploring an option that may be productive. I think they ought to recognize that if they now were to recant and to continue their nuclear program, try and reprocess or something of that sort, I think that they are now in a position in which that would be regarded as so flagrant that we'd have less trouble getting China and getting Japan to go along with our sanctions.
It seems to me that while these details are important of how close they are, how long they have to wait with fuel rods and cooling tanks, the fundamental point is that Kim Il-sung is committed to developing nuclear weapons and becoming a significant nuclear weapons state, and all the rest is maneuver intended to give him the time and opportunity to accomplish that goal.
Well, I can't read Kim Il-sung's mind. His behavior
You can't? Why not?
His behavior certainly suggests, particularly when they remove the core of the reactor, that is their intention. The problem is, I don't believe we've fairly tested it. I mean, we've had a long path of diplomacy, but we've never put a clear and precise deal on the table that said, here's what we want you to do, and here's what happens when you do it.
Let me interrupt a minute. You said you couldn't read Kim Il-sung's mind. What about Jimmy Carter's mind? He's suddenly become a big player in this discussion. In the recent edition of the New Republic, Josh Moravchik offered some quotes from the past about how Jimmy Carter dealt with and apparently thought of communist dictators. He described Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, as the capital is a bustling city where shoppers pack the department stores which look like Walmart in America's Georgia. Earlier of the Shah of Iran, he said, your country is an island of stability because of the love which your people give to you. Of Marshal Tito, he said he is a man who believes in human rights and exemplifies the eagerness for freedom and independence and liberty. And of the bloodthirsty Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, he said, our goals are the same, to let the people of the world share in growth, in peace, in personal freedom, and it goes on and on. And the last one is of First Secretary Edward Gierek of Poland, which the New Republic, which Josh Moravchik describes as a stolid Stalinist. He said, our concept of human rights is preserved in Poland. Now, Carter goes to North Korea and hugs Kim Il-sung and says, "Hey, we got a deal here. This is a great guy."
Yeah, but the fact is, we aren't dealing with Jimmy Carter in these negotiations. So I find all of that basically irrelevant. We have an opportunity to test Kim Il-sung at this point. Find out whether he's serious about really stopping his nuclear program.
But Paul,
and I agree with Bob Manning. We got to find out what kind of a package we can present, and then present him with the alternatives. This is what you can get if you give up the nuclear ambition, and this is what you're going to get if you go ahead with it.
But Jimmy Carter has derailed an admittedly faltering, halting administration policy that was moving toward
I think he's
some
strengthened.
expression of resolution.
I think we're going to have more of a chance of getting tough sanctions if at this point Kim Il-sung proves to be a false prophet in terms of what he's going to do.
Paul, if you think sanctions wouldn't have worked anyway, and I think sanctions wouldn't have worked anyway,
right,
then it's no great loss to have lost the opportunity to undertake sanctions.
We haven't given up
but
any
what
of the
we've
options.
also done, as long as this so-called freeze continues, we will be prevented from taking any other action. And at the end of the day,
I think it depends upon how the talks go. If it comes clear that he is just stalling, I see no reason why we can't make the necessary military
when will we
preparation.
decide that he's stalling? How long are you prepared to give him?
Well, I'm not going to be the negotiator, unfortunately. I'll be able to give you a better timetable if I were.
Let me ask one question, just to sort of give our viewership and ourselves sort of a sense of what we're talking about. It is my view, as much more of an amateur in foreign policy than you all, that nuclear non-proliferation is the single most important foreign policy issue that the United States and the world faces. I mean, Bosnia is localized, Somalia is localized, all these things are localized. If you go into a situation where a crazy state builds bombs and sells bombs, and instead of having, how many nuclear states do we have now? 8, 10, something like that. You have 20, you have 30, you have 40. Do we end up with a world where our grandchildren are really in deep stuff?
I think no question about it. I think that President Clinton said that in his UN speech last September, that non-proliferation was one of our very highest priority items, and it should be, which is why we can't let North Korea get away with it.
But the question is, what does it mean not to let North Korea get away with it? Because I think what's going to happen is that in a very short time, a couple of months perhaps, we're going to face this very, very serious crisis as they start to get the wherewithal for the bomb. In other words, as they actually try to get the plutonium. Now, sanctions are all well and good, but let's go through that scenario. Let's suppose that when they start to get the plutonium, everybody says, my God, this is horrible, and we get a great coalition, and within a month or two, very heavy-duty sanctions are enacted by the UN, and 6 months after that, the North Koreans really begin to feel the pinch. Well, by then, they're going to have what they want, and by then, they will have the wherewithal for the bomb. So very shortly, I think, you're going to be looking not just at a sanctions option if things go the wrong way, if the talks don't work out.
Right.
You're going to have to at least examine the military option, and I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying it is going to be looming there sooner than we may think.
Paul, suppose the negotiations work out well.
Right.
Have we not set up a scenario where every two-bit tin pot dictator around the world says, hey, I'm going to start a nuclear program also, and I'm going to get economic aid, and I'm going to get this, and I'm going to get recognition, and Jimmy Carter's going to come over? It becomes a great diplomatic business, doesn't it?
Well, what is the alternative, Ben? I mean, we shouldn't talk. We shouldn't try and find out what we could do to prevent them going ahead with a nuclear program.
Don't
Be a
ask me.
lot
We have
cheaper.
experts.
No,
What's
no.
the alternative?
It'd be a lot cheaper than a
Okay,
war.
what's the
Well, first of
alternative,
all,
guys?
I'm not.
But there is a principle that can be extracted from this, and that is we have seen now over the last couple of years a succession of American concessions to the North Koreans. We removed our nuclear weapons from South Korea. We canceled or postponed military exercises. We have done one thing after another to induce the North Koreans to be cooperative, and in doing so, we have said to the world, we will back down. We will lay out policies. The President said that it was unacceptable, inadmissible to allow the North Koreans to have a nuclear program. That's no longer the American position.
Richard,
we are vacillating, and that has to be an encouragement to others who would challenge the United States.
Paul asked an interesting question a moment ago. He said, well, what are you going to do about it? And you said, I think actually on an earlier program in this series, that we have to be prepared to do a Sirak, which was the Israeli bombing of the Iraqi
in
nuclear...
1981,
right.
The Israeli Air Force attacked and destroyed a reactor that was about to come online near Baghdad. It was a breathtaking display of bombing accuracy. They destroyed the reactor and did no damage beyond the reactor site itself. The North Koreans have a reprocessing plant at Yongbyon. We know exactly where it is.
But they also have 1 million men 20 miles away from Seoul, and boom, in they go, and you were talking about a mass conflagration.
The question is, would the surgical destruction of that reprocessing facility lead to a North Korean invasion of South Korea, or wouldn't it? And I don't think we know the answer to that.
That's only one of the risks. The larger problem is we probably don't know where all the targets are. A hot cell in which you can reprocess is about an 8 by 10 size. This is a country that has thousands of tunnels, that has made an art of building factories into mountains. So we don't know where the targets are. And are we going to, that's number one problem. Secondly, there is the risk. I think the only scenario I can see them starting a war is an act of suicide, because they know deterrence does work. But on the other hand, if they think that we're coming after them and this is the end, somebody in North Korea may very well be tempted to make sure that if they're going to lose, the South doesn't win.
This is your David Koresh scenario.
Yes,
is that
this
right?
is Waco revisited.
Waco West.
If we don't know where the targets are, then how are we ever going to know that they've stopped their nuclear program? If they can do it covertly, then we will never have any assurance that they're not doing it, no matter what they agree to in these talks. Well, you can't have it both ways.
No, that's an important point. And what I would argue is there is no 100% guarantee. No verification system is going to give you 100%. That is why we worked with the South Koreans to get them to agree to a North-South bilateral inspection regime that is more intrusive. And in theory, we should set up a challenge regime so that when we do get some information, we can check it out on a rapid basis.
If the verification scheme is worth anything at all, it means we know basically where the targets are, and I think we do know where the targets are.
Well, you are going to be left with this very stark choice, potentially. And again, it could be during the congressional elections this fall, for example, sometime when it would be kind of sticky for us to have to think hard about these issues. They're on the verge of getting the material for the bomb, let's say. Then you have to decide, is it worth destroying this facility, taking some of the risks? Is it, we're going to benefit enough from destroying the facility? Will the signal be sent? Or do we shrink from this and have to deal with this through containment?
The signal caller in this situation is going to be Bill Clinton. There is an argument that is being made is that in much less important situations, in Haiti, in Somalia, in Bosnia, Clinton has sent such mixed signals, the flip-flop sort of diagram, that he has already self-undermined his own ability to negotiate this terribly dangerous thing. You buy that proposition, Paul?
No, I don't. It seems to me that there's no reason we should not explore the possibility of getting a deal. And I think that the president ought to be involved personally. I think, for one thing, that it's quite clear that Kim Il-sung responds to that sort of flattery. And it shouldn't be left just to lower level. I think the president ought to be involved. We ought to see if we can cut a deal. We haven't foreclosed any of these other options. And it seems to me the alternative at this point is that we launch some sort of military action now. And I say that is premature. It should not be tried.
Sandy Spector, let me ask you this question. Just a while ago, you were one of the, dozen or so people who were asked into the White House to help brief the president on this situation. He's a very charming man. He knows a lot. Are you convinced that he is on top of this thing and understands the full magnitude of this?
I think the White House was in pretty good shape when they had this briefing. There were nuanced differences among some of the players on their side of the table, but among the experts that were coming in, there was an enormous difference of opinion, and I would say we looked in much worse disarray than the other side. So I think they're doing fine.
What else is new? Yeah,
well, there's one point I think that needs to be stressed. The one positive thing about the Carter trip to me was that you can't deal with a hierarchical system in which there's a very few people, perhaps only one, that makes a decision, and deal with a bunch of bureaucrats. And I think the point Paul made is important, that when you show Kim Il-sung, you take him seriously. If there's any chance of a deal, that's the way you will get it.
The thing that would impress Kim Il-sung most significantly, it seems to me, is if he understood that his reprocessing facility could disappear in a matter of hours. And by the way, once that reprocessing facility is functioning and you have nuclear material in there,
then it's a lot tougher.
It's much more difficult, and we ought to make it clear to Kim Il-sung that we don't want another Chernobyl, that before this facility becomes radioactive, it will cease to exist.
Let me ask a final question here, if I might. Let me go around the table here, starting perhaps with you, Paul, and ask, here we have a variety of views. What do you all agree upon, and what do you disagree upon?
I'd say what we agree upon is that North Korea cannot be allowed to become a nuclear power. And we ought to find out whether we can cut a deal so that they will buy off from their pursuit of a nuclear capability. I think that's what we agree on.
And what do we disagree about?
I guess we disagree on the feasibility of cutting a deal. I guess we disagree on whether negotiations can conceivably be fruitful. In my opinion, they can, and we ought to try it.
Sandy?
Or we ought to keep our other options open.
Well, I think that's just where I would come out too, in the sense there's certainly no harm in active negotiations. If we get a deal, terrific, then we can all breathe easier. But what would be a mistake, I think, is to put all our hopes on the deal and not take precautions in the event that they don't work out. I do not think the administration is only looking to the deal. I mean, they are also building up some military strength in the region, and that's all to the good. And I think the American people perhaps have to appreciate that there is this other dimension that is lurking in the background.
Do you think Richard is being too tough on this?
I think you may be ready to launch a strike tomorrow? I don't think so.
No, I don't think we need to launch a strike tomorrow, but I think unless you have decided that you will launch a strike before you will allow North Korea to become a significant nuclear power, and I think in practical terms that means before you allow them to reprocess the fuel they now have into plutonium. So once you make that decision, then I think it's fine, sit down at the table, but make sure that your allies know that you've made that decision, and that the North Koreans know that you've made that decision.
You agree with Paul and the rest of the panel that we ought to proceed with the negotiations? I mean,
only after we make the decision that if the negotiations fail, we will do what the Israelis did and end the program in that way. Because if you don't make that decision first, there is a risk that you go on negotiating past the point at which they take irreversible action and become the nuclear power we're trying to prevent them from becoming.
Bob Manning, you're last. What do we agree upon? What do we disagree upon?
Well, I guess I'm looking at it a little bit more from a regional perspective. This is a communist dinosaur that doesn't have much of a future. And I think prudence dictates that we do reinforce and strengthen deterrence. But the notion that we should initiate a conflict over this, I'm not quite there yet.
Okay. Thank you, Robert Manning, Richard Perle, Leonard Spector, Paul Warnke, and thank you. As you know, this is a new program, and we have appreciated hearing from you very much. Please send us your comments to the address on the screen. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.